Hey everybody, time for a quick project on the Camaro, and I'll confess this is something I've been putting off for a while. You know, when you're working on a project, as big as trying to get a 25-year parked car back on the road, there's a lot of things you do, and there's things you kind of set on the side and say, I'll do those someday. Well, some days come, but it's really more important than that, and I shouldn't have really waited so long. The battery in this car is not fastened down. The original clamp and bolt were missing, and I've put up with it and just not fixed it. But that's really a bad idea, and I should have done this sooner. But I've tracked down through Camaro Central some parts, and we'll get to that in a minute. But there are two things. One is, with your battery rocking around, if you get in the wrong hit the wrong bump and you bounce the battery, you can short the terminals to ground and have a pretty big arc under the hood and maybe even a fire. It could be pretty bad. This car's tray has got the battery captured pretty well, but those side terminals are only that far away from the fender well at one point, and that fender well's steel, so they're only a short distance from the fender well. Second thing is that it's really not good for your battery for it to bounce around. In other words, there should be less shock if the battery is tied to the car and the car hits a bump. You have shock absorbers, tires, you absorb some of that. If you hit a really good pothole and the car goes through its motion and the battery jumps and smacks, 12-volt car batteries have plates inside. If you bounce them around and rattle them too hard, you could loosen up the plates. You could end up having a short in a cell and your battery failing on you, and that's no fun either. Batteries aren't cheap. So anyhow, this morning I'm going to fasten the battery down. Now, as I said, when I got this car, the clamp and bolt and system was missing, and it's not that hard to hunt down, but I went down to I was buying some parts at Camaro Central, so they have this wedge-shaped clamp that holds the battery down at the base, and it says that it's good for 1982 to 2002. And I found some other places where you could buy this clamp, at some of the local parts stores, except they didn't have it in stock. I think Dorman sells one. There are a couple of them. That are reproductions of original. What I really didn't have was the bolt, and that's one of the reasons I chose where I did. Was the stores carry the wedge, and you can buy the wedge different places. You could order it and pick it up locally, but I wanted the bolt, and the Camaro Central folks say that this bolt goes from 1982 to 1992. And it's an original GM battery tray clamp bolt. It's not a reproduction, but it's the real thing, which is kind of nice because if you're not worried about originality and restoration, go to the hardware store and buy a bolt. I've been trying to keep this car sort of original, and so when I go for parts, I try to duplicate the factory original as much as I can. Having worked for GM and worked for, in engineering with bolts and things, I also know is that if this is the original GM bolt, that the coatings and so forth are intended to be correct for corrosion protection and environmental and so forth. So next is, if you don't want this bolt, what is it, First of all, what is it, right? This bolt is, I'll do this in English terms, this bolt is basically 2 inches long, thread length, with a point on it so that the assembly plant had an easier time getting it started. It's got a lead in. It has a trapped washer under the head, which will be important in a minute. It is, I'm going to measure the diameter with my inch. It is a .313, which is an 8 millimeter. If you run the calculator conversion, that's an 8mm. Out of my tap and die kit, I have a thread gauge, and that dude measures out to be 1.25. So you ought to be able to go get if you want a generic bolt, go get an 8mm by 1.25 pitch, and you ought to thread in there. The other thing is, when you start going to work on it, you'll need it's down at the bottom, so you'll need a pretty good extension or a good deep socket on a regular extension. And the head on this one is a 13mm, which is a very common one on these cars. Let's go bolt her down. Okay, so here's the battery in my Camaro. This one's mounted in the right front. And first thing you'd say is, well, gee, where does it go, right? Get the light in the right place. I don't see a spot. And gee, look at, there's the positive terminal, and you can see how close it gets underneath there to the steel. And I'll just add, is if the battery's bouncing around, those terminals can loosen up on you and leave you stranded. Because if you start tugging on the cables, you can loosen up the bolts. Anyhow, you can't see any place for a clamp. That's because the battery has worked its way to the back. So let me see if I can set the light down here. There's a spot on the front of the tray. Just really difficult to get down in there and see. There's a spot on the front of the tray that will catch the battery. So if you slide the battery forward where it belongs, you see there's a bolt hole and a little recess down there. Now you got to be really careful with this because things are connected. But I'm going to go down here and drop that plastic guy in. It would probably be better if I took the ground cable off, but I'm going to be careful this morning and do it without disconnecting the battery, because then that means disconnecting the ECM and all the things that go with that. Alright, so I got the hole lined up. Keep this light away from there. Let's drop the bolt in. They don't make this one real easy to reach, do they? All right, you can see the bolt is just dropped in the hole. And this is why the factory bolt is nice with the washer under the head, just because it limits your, actually we're going to drop a socket on it, and I can spin this in with my extension and get it started. But you can see that that wedge catches the edge of the battery case. There's a notch on the battery case for it to hold. I'm going to crank this down. There hasn't been one in there for a long time, so the threads are not in great shape. I mean, it's not spinning easily, but alright, now it's run down, good and tight. Battery doesn't move. I can give it a yank, it's tight. I think the threads were pretty well corroded in there. It took me a bit to get a bit of torque to get through, but now I'm all good. Okay, that's another job done. Now that she's bolted in, I can feel more comfortable taking it out on the road and not worrying about that battery. You say, one of those projects that I put off and shouldn't have, and now I got it taken care of. Check it off the list. That's all for now.